Yes.
Okay.
You get new ideas.
It should be judges. Okay. There are many problems.
Everyone here?
No.
It's one at one.
That's the big one.
Is it right here?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the motion about political campaign funding, without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Peters.
It's a much talked about fact that the existence of the super PACs is highly controversial. We think that when corporations are affected by whatever policy the state sets, we think that corporations will always make sure, regardless of how they do it, they will always make sure that the party that favors their policy is being voted in. And they normally do this by funding the specific party. We have seen this in issues of companies funding the Republican Party, because just because the Republican Party's policy suits it even more. We think that that's extremely bad. Moreover, we think that this kind of super PACs and company do at times force parties to support its ideals, because it tells them that, hey, we have given you the money, so support our kind of ideals. We think that's very harmful, because we think that firstly, super PACs do affect people in the middle, like people who are within a gray area who don't actually know who to vote yet. We think that super PACs affect their rationale, in which we'll further clarify to you in our arguments. We have few problems today. Number one, we think that super PACs creates an idea that is not following the principle of democracy, because there isn't exactly proper representation. They paint a picture that as long as the party has a richer support for it, it would win. We think that that's extremely problematic. Secondly, that the anonymity within the super PAC itself makes it impossible for state or any other organization to intervene and take control of such kind of situation that cannot be controlled, that is further worsening. And thirdly, when parties win on the basis of being biased to corporation, it also means that the corporation's extremist kind of idea will, because it gets elected in. That's why we think those are the few problems today. On the outside, the model is simple. Firstly, from systematically supporting this. Secondly, we are okay with people, for example, individuals, to do, because we think democracy is based on having ulterior motives. Ulterior motives is available in super PACs. That's why we are not allowing super PACs to do so. We are allowing individuals. And thirdly, why even with individual donation, we will still put a cap on the amount you can donate, which is something that doesn't happen within super PACs itself. We are very proud to propose. We're going to prove to you three arguments today. Firstly, how this causes unfair and construct representation of the people. Secondly, how people's representation is being trivialized. And thirdly, how our policy incentivizes politicians to cater to everyone, to the general republic. But let's look at the first argument, which is why it's unfair representation of the people. on the first level, we think that this kind of super PACs never follow the principle of democracy, because we think that it always hides behind the false idea. It hides behind a blanket of truth. This is problematic because when super PACs always legitimize always legitimize their kind of action, we think it's very problematic, because we have to understand the principle of democracy, that it's never about you being richer or poorer. It's simply about your sit down ideas. We think that super PACs hinder the principle of democracy from flourishing because they always have ulterior motives. They support parties, they support parties because they believe that that party's policy only suits them without thinking about the policies, whether it affects the others or not. We think that we think that that go against the entire principle of democracy. Secondly, how under this case, it allows corporation, if they do fund a specific party, it directly makes one party much more stronger, because we think that parties will get stronger very unfairly, because they are not being supported on the basis of their kind of ideology. It's about what they sit down, it's about what they can provide for the corps, and the more money they have for the campaigns, the more money they have for the campaigns, the more they gain support. We think that we give you an example, the NRA, when it supports and only funds Republicans so that the Republicans will support its gun policy, so the NRA will garner support. We think that when that happens, it only happens because the NRA wants to be benefited from their kind of policy. We think it's extremely harmful. On the third level, how this is harmful to the state? Because we think that it harms the perception of democracy, that the state hides the democracy behind a blanket and a veil of words, that they never fully follow the true ideas of democracy. In which it's extremely
people vote for their own interests. How is it different from your case? Because the government will eventually serve the majority.
True, we think that government has to serve majority, but like what we told you, especially that this issue is pertaining to people in the gray area, in the middle, that just because political parties are funded by rich companies, it also means that the rich companies will provide it funds to provide more banners for these kind of people. We think that people in the gray area who probably don't sit down, who probably don't receive, all kind of news coverage, would be affected by this, in which we'll further clarify on. Onto my second argument, which is why people's representation is trivialized. Because we think that party are supported, when party is supported by richer companies, they only want policy that favors them. It's never about altruism. It's always about ulterior motives and business motives. We think that it's only about getting support and a policy that supports it. On a second level, we think that that entire concept trivializes democracy, because people on the ground, people on the fence, people on the borderline, they can't determine what their true idea is. Because just because a corpse sit down, just because a corpse that is, it also means that the person can, they have more coverage to that kind of thing. We think that that is extremely unfair. And on a third level, it directly brings harm to voters' life, because you harm their entire rationale. The fact that they are not being affected, they don't determine their idea based on what they truly believe in, but they determine their idea based on that kind of, like banners who support that. We think is extremely harmful, because you make them regret the decision after they realize what they're trying to do. And my last substantive point, which is how our policy incentivizes politicians to cater to everyone. On the first level, we think that public, because he only wants to cater towards corporations itself, because they only want, we have to know that political parties always want to win election, and we think that when they find an entity that provides them that kind of money, we think that they would rather go for that kind of system. They act complicit because they never provide and cater for everyone's need. On the second level, we tell that politicians can no longer depend on cops on our side, because they have to fight in the campaigns even much harder. We think that our side incentivizes politicians to work harder to create a policy that supports everyone, because we think that when they have to run stronger campaigns, it means it's harder for them to garner support. When people run stronger campaigns and when the campaigns become tighter and tighter without the interference of company, it means that it leads to healthier democracy. Stronger representation also means
They disagree with the idea that corporations have the rights to fund political campaigns just because that now the parties can actually rhetorically support the campaigns and also help the parties in expanding the manifestos of the awareness of the manifestos inside society's mind. But how is that exclusive to where society also has the rights to do such a also has the rights to hold up banners to actually show their support toward political campaigns and also influence people to stay with the same ideology as they have. We don't see any exclusivity coming from side government's explanation here about the real problem in corporations actually trying to fund political campaigns, right? That's proof. Going to hide democracy. This is why I move on to my rebuttals, Madam Chair, in which they say that it's going to hide democracy, right? Because right now corporations can impose any laws that they want. We tell you that this is ridiculous. Why? Because democracy has a parliament in the first place, and then therefore lawmaking wouldn't be a problem at all. Representation will always be there. Therefore, even if these Republicans are actually incentivized by the corporations to actually impose a law because of the corporations wanted them to do so, this lawmaking wouldn't be an absolute in the end of the day, because they are also well to actually give out their own opinions, meaning to say it's still going to be a fair democracy, and therefore it wouldn't actually hide the idea of democracy at all. Sit down, guys. But then is it an unfair form of representation? Because right now they say it is not about whether you are richer or poorer to decide the country. Coming from side government, we say yes. But here is the situation. If a rich guy actually supports a party for his own rich interest, right? Why is that to actually decide which party is going to protect the best interest of him? It is very subjective. If you want to actually if you want to elect a party, it is always in electing a party on the same interest as you, and therefore your interest could be protected by these parties as well. So meaning to say, if you're trying to say this, that these corporations have no rights to actually vote, to actually support these corporations just because they have an interest to protect, then therefore we also tell you that you're disagreeing with the idea for allowing the rich to also protect their own interests by actually supporting these parties rhetorically or is it funny or even voting. Therefore, you're more undemocratic in today's debate. But then, is higher competition in campaigns such a bad thing? Before that, yes, Deborah.
But then engaging on the idea that corporations make political campaigns towards their favor, which means that that this political party can only get their money if they make policies in favor of them, and they will do it.
We tell you what's wrong. Corporations are actually stakeholders in today's debate, right? But I will explain to you later. So, is higher competition in campaigns such a bad thing? We tell you no, because it's still okay, regardless of whether or not the corporations is going to fund them or not, right? Because competition is always existent inside political campaigns, and we don't see how is it suddenly unfair. You are trying to say suddenly that every party has to have the same revenue to actually make political campaigns is simply absurd, because it's always dependent on how much advantages that you have in actually strategizing your own political campaigns, and therefore we still think it's legitimate, right? So moving on with two contentions in my today's debate. First of all, I'm going to prove to you how is it a legitimate right as members of society. How? Because right now, according to democracy, every people and also every stakeholder who are affected by the possibility of the future government inside the country has the rights to choose and has the rights to support. Under operation of the elections, because right now the future party that is going to be elected as government would have the rights to actually decide policy making upon these companies, revenue making of these companies, and also profit making of these companies. And because that this company's main interest is because of profit, and this government has the rights to actually decide how much they can actually create, then therefore it affects the company as well. Therefore, the company also has the rights to actually decide this kind of decision in the first place, right? And because of this, we actually think that people have the rights to do so, because it is a simple parallel case in which normal individuals inside society who are also affected by the policy making of the state, that is why they have the rights to vote for the party that would govern them in the end of the day. And therefore, it is also justified for them to actually support the party rhetorically, or even try to support the party through conversation with people and spreading that ideology. Why? Because first of all, that kind of influence is not absolute. Therefore, it's because it's not absolute, it wouldn't influence people immediately when they actually try to influence this idea to other people, and therefore it is okay for them to do so, because they still have a right to support this kind of parties and also try to convince others to support the party so that their interest is also protected. Under this situation, we tell you it's legitimate. Why? Because right now, these companies who are actually going to politically help this parties politically campaign wouldn't actually have that kind of absolute influence. Why? Because they can only fund money only into political campaigns. Meaning to say, at the end of the day, it's just about campaigning, spreading awareness of your own manifestos. Injecting money into it wouldn't make a difference on how suddenly you could actually brainwash the people of the ones who come to the political campaigns. Then therefore, we tell you that's just no form of coercion. But what does this mean, ma'am? It means that it's still in line with a fair election, in which these companies don't even use any form of coercion, and because of that, their influence are not absolute. Then therefore, the election, during this process of elections, when they actually inject money into these political campaigns, it is still not wrong. But we think that it's still not wrong for these corporations to also not do so, because they have the right to actually support and try to gain and try to increase the advantages of these parties to politically campaign much better. But for that, yes.
Okay, more money means more ads. More money means a better PR person who can also influence people. We think that when you have too much money, you essentially have control over the people.
Yeah, but we don't see how it's wrong, because that's strategy about electing. But then people are also rational at the end of the day. People will also analyze their policy making and also analyze the manifestos in which one is going to be much more in their best interest. People would actually think that when there's more advertisements, when there's more banners, suddenly I'm going to vote for that party. Because as a rational member of society, I am aware that a future party that I'm going to elect or not, I would do my own research in actually finding out which one is the best for me. Therefore, rationality still exists. That company still has the best advantages in strategizing their political campaigns. Therefore, we tell you, we've already proven to you how these companies still have a legitimate form of legitimate right as members of society as well, because they are stakeholders of the election. But also we tell you there is a legitimate procedure in elections as well, because there's no form of coercion in today's debate, because we don't see how suddenly when you inject money, people would suddenly become irrational in deciding what kind of party would govern them. So because of this, we still think that it's a right for companies who also have an interest to protect to actually support which party is going to support them at the end of the day.
Thank you. Yeah. I knew. Great. Political diversity is an extremely important principle in democracy. Representation is also an extremely important principle in democracy, where not only money, but also the lower income and middle income family groups, right? Minorities are also extremely important, and these people are ones who are lacking that representation in society today. And if you do allow corporations to continue to fund and control the political sphere and discourse that happens right now, you essentially take away all forms of representations from these other parties, and this is extremely harmful towards a democracy that needs to function properly, right? What I'm going to tell you about today is one, how we allow the diversification of the political sphere on two levels. One, how you are inhibiting the progression of politics in itself for parties, but secondly, how we also create a more diversified political arena. But before I move into those two substantives, right, let's look at a few rebuttals. Okay, on the idea of corporation representation, right, and that corporations should have rights. Okay, sit down, Mo, I'll take you later. Okay, we totally agree that there needs to be a representation from corporations as well. But we think that this representation can come from the employers or even the CEOs of these companies when they come to voting, right? We don't think that corporations themselves who have the money and who have all that control to continue to use their money and use this money to create ads and to necessarily control the policies of these people, right? What happens now is this, right? What happens is this, okay? Sit down, both of you. Okay, is that more money means more ads. More ads means more discourse, right? And more discourse, when I say more discourse, it means that only one form of discourse that's coming from them, right? Because they are allowing corporations to do this in the first place. Spreading ideas from, using their money to spread ideas is a huge political power that only corporations can do and put upon society, right? We think what happens now is that, is that they control all the discourse that happens in society today. And society doesn't even know that these corporations are behind it. And that's the problem in today's, in their case, right? Is that, corporations are one pushing politicians in towards those policies, right? And not only that, that these corporations are using their money to control ads and telling people that yes, this policy is good in the first place. And there cannot be a discourse when the only corporations are controlling it, because no one is willing to go against the money of the corporations themselves. Because if they do, that means that they cannot be elected because they don't have the funds to use those ads to counter it. Okay. Before I move on, yes.
Because people in secondary school also create banners for their own self-interest, and not many know where these banners come from. Are you now going against those individuals as well?
No, I don't. Okay, one, I don't even understand what FPI even means. Political representation, right, needs to be on a more equal level. Okay, what you don't understand on your side is that corporations are making it not equal. What we do on our side is to mitigate and to ensure that all parts of society get the same. This is because corporations will try to convince politicians to only cater towards corporations, right? And it's extremely harmful when corporations have all the money and the lower income, middle income societies don't have it, right? Sit down, I just took you. Okay, but secondly, they never responded to Kenneth's arguments. I'm going to reiterate a few of them, right? Unfair representation was something that they never talked about. All they talked about was corporate responsibility and maybe for corporations to have that political debate as well. Really prove to you how that's not mutually exclusive, and that also happens under our side, right? But what they totally don't know is that they're allowing corporations to today the monopoly over the information that is getting passed towards people, right? And this is why Kenneth told you about the construed perception of reality that these people actually have, that they also never rebutted, right? And we think it's actually that they need to deal with this, and I'm also going to prove to you a few more things, right? So moving into my first level of analysis of substantive is this, right? How we allow the diversification of the political sphere. What happens now is that corporations inhibit the progression of politics because they necessarily want to control all the policies that these people, that politicians create, right? Because politicians have to kowtow and bow towards these corporations because if they even want to be in the office or the Senate itself, they need the money to create those ads, right? So this means that the politicians themselves will say that, yes, I will take your money and I will do your policy, right? And this is extremely harmful, considering that corporations are extremely powerful and they manage to put the Tea Partiers in the US, right, who are they're extremists actually, right? And they are trying to put policies that actually harm the people on the ground themselves. But the thing is that people don't actually know because the corporations are monopolizing the ideas in the first place, right? And when this happens, there's no discourse happening, right? Because corporations don't only control, let's say, one side of the sphere. They don't only control Republicans. They also control Democrats in itself. So when corporations can control both sides of the party, there is no more discourse, right? And it's extremely harmful towards any policy that you want to create to stop these politicians in the first place. Sit down, I'm not going to take you anymore, okay? But secondly, on also this idea about how even trying to inhibit these corporations from gaining too much power, right? Corporation tax, and things like the NRA, where they're controlling necessarily the gun control laws. We think this is extremely problematic, right? So the conclusion to this argument is this, right? You're giving them too much absolute power sphere, right? And allow the progression of the parties themselves, because if you want to have that money and that power and that campaign funds, right, you need to be an extremist Republican like in the Tea Party. Sit down. Okay, now moving to my is this, right? How we on our side promote a more diversified political arena, and this is something that's very important now, is that if you ever want to get elected in this sense, right, you don't necessarily need to change your ideologies towards a corporations one, right? What happens now is that corporations ask you to totally discard your ideology and replace them with their own. But what happens when it's only individuals who are voting you in, right, and not corporations who are super rich? And obviously we camp the individuals themselves. Is that you allow alternative ideas to flourish and independent parties to also be able to voice out their opinions more, because they don't have to necessarily convert into a different political ideology, right? And this is better because you need to understand that this increases the representation of smaller minorities, right, who are trying to get their voice out there, but cannot because they necessarily go against the corporation's ideals in itself. And this is extremely important towards people in South, because they get the more political instance and a better democracy, right? In conclusion in this debate, what happens is that we cater towards a more middle and lower income group, right? And we cater towards a full representation of society today, and not just a weighted conspiracy towards corporations. Side proposition takes this debate.
Madam Chair, I want Nescafe, and my father will buy me Nescafe, and that's the form of manifesto he provided me, and that is for my interest. If someone were to buy me a lot of Milos and provide me with a lot of advertisement saying to buy Milo, I would suddenly shift to Milo just because of that. But eventually, I will still love Nescafe because I love the idea of Nescafe itself. This is parallel towards voting. Because what? Towards voting. Because of why? Because when you vote for your own personal interest, and therefore the government, the party that's going to govern the country is the state that provides the interest of the majority at the end of the day. People vote based on their own interest or their own religion interest at the end of the day, and not just because of something that they are trying to say. But I have a lot of rebuttals in today's debate. Firstly, on how they say that these companies will fund for their own interests. We don't see the problem in this because it's not as if the company are the ones who vote. The company are just financially supporting this political campaign. Therefore, it is not detrimental at the end of the day. But also, onto the point of how campaign affect the mindset that the people who can't vote, people who live in the borderlines in a remote area, like they don't know the decision. We believe that at the end of the day, it's still an informed choice that these voters have taken. They have voted for that. Even with campaigns, they can still pick even with those type of campaigns, they can still pick the other party. There's no obligation that in which this political campaigns will ask you to vote for another party. But also, the check and balance inside the democracy still applies, in which there's a gradual election, in which if you think your vote have been a bit influenced towards the wrong side, then you can actually vote for another party, and that is the form of check and balance. But also, we don't think so, because it's even more fair on our side, because now we provide the rights to actually express their political view. We actually uphold the right for you to actually campaign before election and what interest they want, and etc. etc. But also onto the point of how there's and also we believe that onto the point of how a campaign which favors the corporation, meaning to say now have towards this bias towards this corporation stand that they take. It is a mutual agreement in which these political campaigns are actually taking the money and actually providing. We believe that it benefits the both at the end of the day. But even if it happens that this corporation funds a lot of money and these political campaigns are, I don't think so, because political party won't suddenly change just because they want fun. Because political parties, they stand to uphold their rights, they stand for their own benefits, and not just for the campaign that they want at the end of the day. But the absurd point is how they say that the more money, more support. We don't think that this is a problem in this debate, because if money is your own interest that you want for the government to have, then it is okay. But before that, Deborah,
Will you engage with the idea that super PACs are going to force ideologies upon political parties to enact extreme policies in favor of them, and they will do it because they want the money. What this means is post-election, extremist view only within that state harmful.
Well, we don't think at the end of the day, when this corporation were to fund these political campaigns, that is extremely biased to this corporation. We think that the society itself can value that form of campaign, because that form of campaign for just this corporation will eventually be detrimental to society, and therefore it doesn't make sense. Your POI, Deborah. But also, I have view on will be affected in the election, and also it's the rights of this corporation to actually flow their money wherever they want. Because firstly, on how corporations are affected in the election, because we believe that it is their right to actually do okay, I'll talk to you on how the rights of this corporation first. Because they generate fund on their own. No, I'll not segment anymore. They generate fund on their own. Their profits are their own money. They are free from the restrictions of spending their money. Therefore, it is their right to actually fund a political campaign. Plus, they have already paid the tax, and they have already done their social corporate responsibility, and etc. etc. Therefore, we don't think the country have the right to actually put this legislation at the end of the day. But also, to the point of corporation affected in the election. No, I'll not say anymore. Because we think that since it is already the rights of this corporation to actually flow their monies towards that when the corporation is actually affected in the election, this right should actually be upheld more. Because of why? We believe that okay, let me paint you a simple picture. Because you have to look at these investors, businessmen, they will eventually favor the pro-econs government, and these conservative people or other people will actually favor the pro-right. What is the main thing that I'm trying to say here? That I am trying to say that actually in a democracy, it doesn't matter which one you favor, and it doesn't matter whether you fund your money towards anywhere. Because at the end of the day, people's right will, the government that serve the society will eventually serve the majority. But also, we actually proven to you what their case wasn't actually realistic in today's debate, because their case was assuming that the political party will suddenly have to put up a new type of campaign just because they want the fund, and this is why we don't think it's true. But also we believe that it is a justified advantage towards any political party in today's debate. Because why? Because corporation can fund their money to any party. It is not as if these corporation are going to fund money towards one party. Therefore, when every corporation can actually fund money to any party they want, eventually these parties can actually gain an avenue of having funds, and it is not detrimental at all, because it is for the people's interest at the end of the day. Society will eventually be very affected with this simple type of campaigns. But at the end of the day, what have side opposition proved to you in today's debate? We have clearly stated to you that their case was an unrealistic case, because they are assuming that every single type of campaign that is provided in when this corporation fund these political campaigns will eventually put up the society to an obligation for them to vote for that party. We don't think so, and that is why their case have fallen in today's debate. And also because on how we believe that their case is detrimental to democracy, and we believe that democracy is the best form of policy, and it's already clean in status quo, and therefore we stick to status quo. But also we have provided to you enough sufficient argument on how we believe that it is the rights of corporation, and also the corporation affected in the election, therefore they have the right to choose whatever they want. And with that, thank you.
Super PACs are not only given the legitimacy to fund politicians' campaign anonymously by any way they want, like Pepsi creating an underground corporate to directly fund them, as well as running away from any caps or any trying for supreme necessarily stop them from doing so, but also the National Rifle Association, that they continuously fund Republican Party to be able to sell their guns. Those are the things that are harmful. Side opposition wanted to fight for democracy and the representation of people. They fight for the things that if it is majority, it is perfectly okay. But we told you, we proved to you, but we already proven to you why, that if you do not allow for the funding and the disproportionality, our side caters to everyone. Our side, at least for a mediation of politics when it comes to the political system, something they didn't want to engage on at all. And our circumstance, we do not want the minority to lose out in an extremist basis, something that we've been fighting for, something they didn't want to engage with. Two issues for today's debate. Number one, the principle of democracy, and secondly, what is necessarily better for people in this circumstance, right? But let's look at my principle of democracy. What we argue to you is the problem of today in political campaigns. When they have the money to construe your vote, the exclusivity they ask us for, we already told you. Number one, it's a lack of limit. Secondly, it's the political companies having the money to fund as many billboards as possible, which means that their outreach to people is more paramount than the other party, right? When that's the disproportionate that causes it. Opposite opposition said, and it's not affected. Three responses to this, right? Because you inhibit people from analyzing on a case-by-case basis when an overarching view is poured drastically upon you. But secondly, an enforced interpretation of benefits as well is served on a silver platter towards you. That is how your view is construed. But secondly, engaging the idea on how people are still rational, two responses. We think that people have those people that we're talking about are the people within the grey areas, those people who are on the fence. That is when an overarching benefit is poured upon them. That is when they won't have the incentive to analyze on a case-by-case basis, because a false interpretation of good is poured towards them. But secondly, because one political party is within the election system, right? And that is when they will necessarily think and construe their minds to think that these, because are going with it, that is when most people are going with it and more people will go towards it, right? But thirdly, on their biggest idea, on the corporation's right to be part of the political system, sit down. We concede that we remove the rights of them as a body because of the no actual benefits that none of them could bring about to us. But we can bring to you three harms of it, right? Firstly, on the abuse of their legitimacy as a union to super PAC, right? Because we think that not only do they do it in their favor, but the NRA continuously fund the Republicans to make sure they enact policies towards their favor, right? It's trying to reach mutual consensus. It will never reach mutual consensus because Republicans always being fun to necessarily go against what is necessarily best. So if a consensus were able to be reached, it will never be reached against it, right? That is the problem within status quo. But secondly, we think that representation of an individual can, if they want to individually give their view and their ideas or political views, we are perfectly fine with that. But thirdly, we also tell you that corporate representation is not necessarily good, because a forced union of ideologies is harmful. Because we think that within the corporation, there are always going to be people with conflicting views. But what happens is when people will never go against the corporation because the corporation holds their very view. So we're perfectly fine. That's why we want to incentivize people to represent themselves individually and never go as a corporation, employers as well, and those things are necessarily harmful. Before I move on, yes.
Okay, what is democracy if you think one party is bad and can't actually have a campaign of guns?
What? Okay, look, if one party is bad in your opinion, that's your rights to vote. We're not provoking any of that. What we're taking away is corporations' unnecessary funding and creating disproportionality within their states. Yeah. So that company that favors them is Republican, they're necessarily going to construe their state within Wyoming or within North Carolina. Those things are harmful. Second issue in today's debate, what's better for people? Let's analyze the nature of super PACs. We think that forced ideologies upon politician party to enact extreme policies in favor to them harmful, something that Yongshan the incentive for them to continuously take their money is because they necessarily want to fund their campaigns better. Secondly, but if you don't accept the money and if you want to go on your view, we think that those things are necessary. They have the more incentive, because if you don't accept their ideologies and if you're not taking the force to go with the policy they make, that means that we will fund your opponents, and that's why they have the most incentive to do it, right? Which is harmful because the people on the ground they oppose are the minority in this sense. So post-election, you will have to go with extremist view, something they didn't understand at all. Because you live by extremist view because you're in accordance with the corporate's extremist view, which means that people who are democratic within their state loses out a lot, and we don't want that on the outside, right? But before I move on, yes.
Yes, Senate can propose anything inside the parliament once they've already been elected in the parliament, right? But here's the thing, their power is not absolute because right now there are also representatives inside the parliament who also want to protect minorities. Your whole assumption that this would happen is simply absurd.
We don't think that's what's happening inside the school. People will necessarily accord to themselves. They can enact any role they want. Even in the House of Representatives, there's a disproportionality because the state that represents them is necessarily Republican. That's how they win. That's how they win the necessary vote. We don't understand your POI. Sit down. But secondly, what we're not okay with minority losing out because we think that under their circumstances, minority loses out post-election, right? What our side is we garner a more mediation of political campaigns. So what we mean by this is we don't want extremist view to come out. We want politicians to be incentivized to reach out to the majority of people, which means they no longer go accordance with the corporates that they want extremist view. They want also not going accordance with the rich people and their extremist view. That is when minority also doesn't lose out post-election, something that we fight for. That's when the proper representation of people is protected. But let's also look at the idea of politicians, something that they were extremely dismissive about. We think that number one, when politicians are no longer reliant upon rich people and no longer reliant on extremely rich companies, they will work harder to campaign, something they didn't want to talk about. Their response to that was politicians are naturally incentivized to cater to most people. We don't think so. We think the rich companies who can construe the vote people on the ground. That's when they can become complicit. On the outside, we remove that and we allow them to work harder towards their campaign, which means they will be forced to accord to everybody on the ground, not people who benefit them the most. And this is extremely important when it comes to policy enacting, right? Because we want politicians to promise policies that cater to everybody and not only policies that cater to the rich corporate company. On the outside, we protect the representation of people. On the outside, we do not let minority lose out in the extremist view in the circumstances on the US. And with all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Yeah.
Since DJ wanted to talk about harms, right, Madam Chair? First issue of today, which side creates more harmful repercussions under their paradigm? What we heard from side government, first harm here, is that they said that they assume that when you implement the motion, right, you force government obligation towards these corporations. Now, how does it suddenly a moral obligation for government to follow whatever the corporation's interest is? We tell you, firstly, this is assumptions, right? Then we tell you, even if that happens, that's not even harmful in the first place. Why? Let's look at the worst case scenario here. Well, the worst case scenario would be under their paradigm that yes, maybe the government does give some tender or some extra benefits towards these corporations, but we tell you that's not even detrimental in the first place because that doesn't make the corporations suddenly fully accountable to the corporation. It doesn't make the political parties suddenly fully be accountable to the corporations. They will still have this say towards the people in the society. The harms here aren't even that great. But also they want to talk about Republicans, about how they tell the Republicans to sell more guns, right? Well, firstly, so what? We tell you that's not even a great harm in the first place. If you're talking about gun management, then that's a problem of enforcement and not a problem with the motion of today. This is why we tell you happen in the first place. But secondly, let's be realistic here. We don't think that when a corporation suddenly funds the government a lot, then suddenly we tell you the government is not completely bound and tied to the corporations in the first place. The governments are not profit oriented, but they are people centralized. How? The government still has this parliament whereby, especially in a democratic setting, right? They'll have this legislative framework. They have discussions before implementing policies. They have this legislative body which is independent, right, Ma'am Chair? This is why, at the end of the day, no matter how much influence a corporation they claim to have, they will not overrule the main aspects of a democracy in the first place. Discussions will happen. They'll judge based on the best rationality of the people in the first place. But also, the government is accountable to the people and will follow the will of the people. We don't think that when a corporation suddenly pays the government, then suddenly they'll be able to to take over the whole voice of the government, and how accountability to the people will not even exist in the first place. This is why their harms don't even exist in this case. But thirdly, right, we don't think that even if they force a government obligation towards corporations, we don't think that this is actually, they don't think that this is necessarily bad in the first place. They deserve it. How? We tell you how this is a legitimate right, but how corporations are affected by the country's policies, right? This is why they should get a say, simply because they are affected and because they have played a part in contributing towards the political parties in the first place. But as a stakeholder, we tell you this is justified. What they are saying is that we tell you how an Indian can vote for an Indian. He has an ulterior motive, which is he wants better racial bias policies towards Indians in the first place. This means that ulterior motive doesn't even matter in the first place because they're still affected at the end of the day. But even if ulterior motives are apparent, we tell you the harms are not that great, as I've told you before. The politicians, right? How they have strong beliefs, they will not succumb to any amount of money that you give them, but we concede to the fact that yes, they need money to fuel their political campaign, right? But not at the expense of their political views, which they started and founded the very campaign on in the first place. This is how their harm won't happen, but also paradigm, right, through money and all the banners. First response, well, that is a campaign. You try to influence people, you try to get as a lot of money as you can, you try to create a lot of banners as you can. That we don't see how that's particularly harmful, because that's what happens in the campaign anyway. But second response, right, let's be but also they try to talk about how this will influence the voting of the people, right? Because more money equals to more advertisements. Sit down, guys. But firstly, we tell you, yes, again, that is a campaign. You try to influence people. You always use avenues to gain advantage. When it's near a campaign, this is when the government suddenly gets a lot of money from the people. They always make all these kinds of banners. They always suddenly be hypocrite and suddenly be good to everyone on the status quo. This is a legitimate form of campaigning, Ma'am Chair. We tell you that the advantages they get are normal, but they talk about influence the voting of people, right? We told you that, well, first response, let's be realistic here. You won't sway the rationality of society. We concede that people in the gray area still won't be swayed. Even though these people are in the gray area, they will not be swayed by these advertisements in the first place. How? We think that because they're in a gray area, this proves that they have no particularly interest towards any sort of political stance. So what they are saying is that once one political party suddenly becomes richer than the other, suddenly these people with the gray area will start liking the richer party with much more colorful banners and who sensationalize their news much more better. We don't think that's particularly the case, and kind of truistic coming from DJ over there. Sit down, guys. But also, we tell you no matter how in the gray area you are, you still have some sense of political sense and follow their interest. Even if they don't vote for the party that they don't want and don't have a particular interest, then they won't even vote in the first place. We don't think that when somebody who doesn't have any clear political view that what they want, that suddenly when you increase the number of banners around them, they will suddenly have this political interest. Very truistic coming from them. But last response, even if their rationality are swayed, money shows capabilities. So it's okay if society choose them because they're choosing the much more richer party, and because of this, we tell you that they'll be much more capable with the harms under their in the first place. This is why we went on this first issue. But before I move on to my second issue, yes, guys.
Okay, Tariq.
Anyone?
If you put more banners saying vote for Tariq because he's handsome, obviously more people policy compared to another person's policy.
The problem
and
here,
this is the monopoly that you are creating.
the problem here is that it's not that people don't know that Tariq is handsome. Everybody knows that Tariq is handsome. But it's just that people wouldn't be bothered to care that I am handsome here, Madam Chair. You sensationalize. It's not because people are neutral, because they don't know of their policies. They know of the policies, they just don't be bothered to care. This is why, Madam Chair, I am handsome. Sit down, Deborah. But also, second issue, which side more better? They tried to talk about representation, right? First response, corporations are a part of society, therefore you should give them representation. Principal contribution. About we're upholding capitalist rights and representation under this certain sense, where corporations are profit oriented and their value is money, right? Now they generate their own profit. They are as how if you're talking about giving back to the state, they already paid tax. Reciprocity is fulfilled. This is how corporations shouldn't be bound by this policy that they want to make, being a very protectionist state under this case. But also, even if somebody, they talk about this monopolization happening, right? Even if somebody proposes of the motion to suddenly implement a policy which is biased towards the corporations, right? They still have to get a majority. Why? Because it's a democracy. Finally, they try to talk about minorities, right? First response, minorities still have their parties where they even if these minority parties lose, that's democracy. That's pro-majority. Democracy is all about the majority, and even if these minorities lose, then it's just the result of a democracy, something mutually. Tell you, Ma'am Chair, that side government Damansara Jaya over here seems against the idea of political campaigns in the first place. We tell you about how when you fight a political campaign, that's not particularly harmful. It happens anyway, Ma'am Chair. But that's proving to you why the harms under their case don't even exist, and why we uphold democracy much more better through aspects of representation, where we don't victimize anyone. This is why we win today. Yeah. Okay. There's a problem coming from side government over here, in which until to this very point, they still fail to prove to us how their government not is exclusive and also different than the problem of people who try to actually sensationalize these parties by actually going through the same kind of methods, by actually putting up banners and also putting up more increasement in advertisement as well, because we see that there's no problem in them doing so. But then the problem is that because they actually didn't respond anything to us, we still think that this kind of burden that we push to them is still unanswered in today's debate. But then here's the issue: can more banners cloud rationality? Because coming from government, they said that more banners, more ads would suddenly now can influence people, and that everyone who can be brainwashed, and therefore rationality can be blurred. But also because the more presence of these banners and also the more presence of these advertisements would then now shift this attention of people to only that certain party. We think this is wrong, because right now I decide parties not because on how many banners and how many presents that they actually exist inside of my view. Because right now I actually only support parties that actually protects my interests. Meaning to say, regardless of whether how much that party actually puts banners, if I still have a party that actually supports my interests, therefore I will always go for that party. Therefore, your whole assumption here is still flawed in today's debate. But secondly, we tell you it's very unrealistic, because I'm also a human being. Therefore, if I actually look at more advertisements and look at your explanation on your manifestos, that doesn't mean I'll automatically love your party in the first place. Therefore, we don't see any problem and we don't see any harm with this kind of method, and therefore we still think that the corporations have the right to do so, because normal people still have the right to do so, right? So second issue, will corporations have more voice in lawmaking? Because government here said yes, and therefore it's problematic because it's going to create an unfair distribution. Therefore, the minority's voice inside parliaments itself would be oppressed, especially people from the grey area. But coming from opposition, we said no, because politicians still have virtues, because they also have a form of liability upon their citizens. Meaning to say that if these companies try to force me to actually pass a campaign that will actually go against my virtue as a politician who represents the people in my state, then therefore I wouldn't actually agree with the idea absolutely. Because right now, this kind of money that they give is actually an obligation for me to follow back to them. Meaning to say, I can always reject back at the end of the day. Therefore, your whole assumption that suddenly I would be totally influenced the company is totally flawed. But then, even if you say that in the end of the day, this policy making that is suggested by the corporations through the senators would still happen in the end of the day, such as like your rifle example, right? Rifle law selling example, right? We still think that it's not wrong, because right now, if there's already a form of agreement from the majority inside the parliament, then therefore we don't see anything that's wrong with it, right, Madam Chair? And therefore, because that's how parliament works in the first place, there are always minorities' view not actually accepted, and we only accept the majority's view that is actually overruled by the minority's view, right? And that is how it simply goes. But then we don't necessarily think that discussion wouldn't happen at the end of the day, because a parliament system, when they want to make a law, they don't just sit there and just say that, oh, I want to bypass this law, I want to bypass this law. They would discuss it thoroughly and try to mitigate the problems that exist in the lawmaking as well. And then therefore, when the law has already been passed, it wouldn't harm any minorities, because minorities are also represented inside the parliaments. Therefore, if it's going to be passed, it isn't going to be harmful to any individual, but also it's going to be beneficial to protect the best interests of the corporations as well. And because it's still in line with the majority's view, therefore it's still democratic. But then who's more democratic in today's debate? Coming from side government here, they said that there's still going to be elections and policy making, but then we tell you that wait. Side government here said that corporations' voice now can actually be voiced out and would overrule any voice, right? Coming from side opposition, we think that that is simply absurd, because right now you're being undemocratic here, because we've already explained to you how these corporations are actually stakeholders in these elections, right? Meaning to say that if you don't take their views into consideration of being presented in the parliament itself, then therefore you're being very undemocratic, because the policy making inside the parliament that could be detrimental towards these corporations then wouldn't be taken into consideration, because their voice is not represented by any senators in the first place. And then therefore this would lead to an undemocratic system, because you're disregarding the views of the stakeholders who are actually affected in today's election. So who actually wins today's debate? It's obvious side opposition.
When 70% of American citizens want gun control laws, but they cannot get those gun control laws because of the monopoly that the NRA imposes on the Senate and the House of Representatives itself, then you have a problem. So what happened in today's debate, right? Three reasons why we win today's debate. Firstly, about corporations' right and who provides better representation in the first place. Secondly, about rationality and check and balance, and whether people can actually choose which party they want to choose. And thirdly, something that they never responded to, but we want to put it in here anyway to look good, democracy, right? And how we provide minority rights and more diversification of ideologies, right? But a few things before I go into those clashes. One, they only mitigate the harm of post-election, right? Or they're what they're trying to do. All the analysis that come, maybe they can, choose to vote that person out, can only happen after the election, right? And we think that even then also it won't happen, because we already gave you the analysis that I'll provide to you later. What they don't mitigate is the pre-election harm about corporations controlling and having a monopoly over the media and controlling the discourse that actually happens. And this happens like when you put banners and ads saying that, yes, this person represents this ideology more compared to someone without a corporation backing them. Obviously means that more people will know and think that, that politician is actually representing me because I see the things, all the banners and ads more, right? We think that's extremely harmful in that sense. Okay, so let's go into the clash points, okay? Firstly, about corporation rights, okay? What were the things that they said? First, that, because corporations should have a play and a part of democracy, right? And they're part of society, that we should give them this right. Okay, we understand that corporations do, to a certain extent, play a part in society, and we agreed to that, right? But what we never wanted to agree to, and this was the thing that they never understood as well, is that corporations control and have too much power over society when they play a part in elections and political campaigns, right? If you want your corporation to be represented, we think that it already happens when employers vote in these campaigns and so on. And this is something that we also told you from the get-go, right? But what happens is when you allow this, right? And this is something that they never responded to, which is very interesting, right? Because apparently they said that too much money doesn't change and doesn't affect the political sphere, but that isn't true, right? Because obviously, if you have a lot more money, you can convince a lot more people and put out a lot more ads, right? And also something that they never responded to from Deborah is that, and Deborah and Kenneth, it's anonymity that happens, and underground that to use that and to also supply political campaigns, right? People don't know what's actually happening. Because of the monopoly and because it's so underground, we definitely take this part of the debate, right? Okay, but secondly, also on the idea of rationality, right? It's Yeah, you can choose who you want to vote in. You can vote, and if they're accountable, and that we can vote them out after that, right? But the thing that is, no, they're not really rational because they only know one side of the story, right? It's a coerced choice happening in this sense, and they never responded to the characterizations that we told you about, right? That guys, really, do you actually believe that money doesn't play an important part of role in campaigns itself? You're enslaving in part society, right? When they don't actually know or hear the counter towards that the corporation's policies themselves, or the politician that is being supported by the corporation, right? Things that they never responded to about this rationality, right? Kenneth's construed perception of reality argument never responded to in the first place, right? And okay, so this is also why we take this second issue. But lastly, the idea of democracy, right, which is very interesting and something that we thought they would have responded to because it was a big chunk of our case, right? Political diversity is extremely important, right? Allowing to represent themselves is extremely important. You take away their representation because it's all collected towards the top 1% or the richest people in that area, right? Without imposing this policy, you don't allow that representation to happen. You take away those rights and the democracy in itself.
So where do we go?
Hey, Jay says to, Kenneth, Jay says to click the stop button.
How do you stop? How do you stop it? Oh, okay. Hi, bye.